when you want to give a good speech, you start out by telling them what you're going to tell them. And then you tell them. Then you tell them what you told them. So let me tell you what I'm going to tell you. That sounds like something I would say. We're going to talk about the high degrees of Masonry. Now, we all informally know what the high degrees are. Sorry, I'm required to give a disclaimer here. There is no degree in Masonry higher than the Master Mason degree. The Grand Master Security of all Masons, the Grand Lodge of Security of the organization. So there's really no such thing as a high degree since the Master Mason said. Okay. We've got the disclaimer. We all know what a high degree is. It's something beyond the Master Mason's degree that continues the story, the legends, the teachings that are contained in the Blue Lodge. But it is separate from the Grand Lodge, and it is controlled by another organization. So it continues the teachings of Masonry. Now, as you heard last night, I'm a mathematician. My brain is wired, just accept it, my brain is not wired the way that everyone else's brain is. I don't know whether it's good, I don't know whether it's bad, but it's just wired the way it is. I like to put things and lay them out in an order. Highest to lowest, smallest to largest. And in this case, when I started doing this research, I said, let's just lay out the high degrees in chronological order. What do we know about them? When do they appear? And that's going to tell us something. And what you're going to see is the first thing. High degree Masonry has been around from about year 1. Now, to be honest, it's year 8, not year 1. But when you're a 250-year-old organization, year 8 is pretty close to year 1. High degree Freemasonry is an integral and essential part of Freemasonry that has been with us for 300 years. It is not some casual tack-on. It's not something you can casually discard and throw away. It is part of the work and the woof of Freemasonry. It is what makes Masonry Masonry. So that's the first thing that I want you to see. The second thing, you're going to see this evolution as we go through. These ideas appear, they catch on, and then you get cross-pollination. And so I think you're going to see when I finish an idea of where high degrees come from. Well, not so much where they come from, where they first appear. I very much am a believer in, okay, what's the first record that we have? What's the earliest source? What's the first date? Once we know that, then we can start looking at what it means. And that's what I'm going to lay out for you. So we're going to start the first written record of the Lodge of Masons, 1598, Aitchison Haven, Scotland. The Lodge at Aitchison Haven, you can see that Robert Witherspoon has just been made a Fellow of the Craft, and he has chosen George Anthony and John Pettit to be his intenders. Well, that's very much what we do today, except the Lodge chooses the intenders, chooses the coaches for the candidate. Next record is 1599. Lodge of Edinburgh, number 1. George Patoun, a member of the Lodge, confesses to the deacons that he had a Cowan to work on the chimney. Scab labor. They're cheap. They haven't gone through the apprenticeship. It's not that they're not skilled, but they haven't gone through the apprenticeship. They're not a member of the Lodge. They don't have the Mason's word. But they're nonetheless quite skilled. If you needed someone to fix the foundation of your house, well, you could always hire a union mason, or you could just hire the local handyman, and he'd fix it for you. That's what a Cowan is. So here we have the earliest minutes of the Lodge, the earliest records, 1598, 1599. And we can see that the Lodge is behaving like a labor union, which is what a craft guild is. It's a labor union. They are given a monopoly by the Crown, by the town, within a certain geographic area to do their kind of work. Masonry, baking, milling, brewing, whatever it is, they have a monopoly. In return, they have to maintain certain levels of standard. You're not going to have the monopoly if you don't produce reasonably good work. Okay, so there's the deal. Now, we know that in 1717, the first Grand Lodge is created in London because the annual Feast and Assembly was no longer being held. The old traditions were falling by the wayside. And so if we had a central organization, that would maintain the Feast and Assembly. Well, The way I look at it, these are the party animals. They miss having the feast and assembly, and so they want to make sure that that big banquet is held. So they create the Grand Lodge. Now that's 1770. 8 years later, we have the first written record of a high degree. And something new is happening in Masonry. An innovation has been made on the body of the craft. And of course, we don't innovate. No. Well, there is the first recorded high degree in Masonry. Now, if you read that, you see that Charles Cotton and Papillon Ball are past masters, and that Brother Gimignani is past the fellow craft and a master. This is the first recorded conferral of the Master Mason's degree. When I was showing you those records from 1598 and 1599 in Scotland, they had 2 classes of members. They had apprentices and they had fellows of the craft. We have a little bit of that today left in the ritual in some Grand Lodges. Now in Maryland, they say you are a Mason, I presume. And the answer is, I am so taken and accepted among brothers and fellows. It's not among brothers and fellows and masters, because when that question was asked, there were only 2 classes, brothers and fellows. There is an is that what you guys say in your Grand Lodge, is so taken and accepted among brothers and fellows? Okay. Yes. Well, then there you go. That's part of a 400-year tradition of having 2 classes of Masons, fellows, brothers and fellows. 1725, the Master Mason's degree now becomes part, it's in the minute books. Now, there's hints that it existed previously, and you have to make inferences, and you have to say, it sounds like they're talking about a separate ceremony, and it sounds like there's a hint here that there's a 3rd degree, but it's not part of the Grand Lodge structure. In the constitutions of the Freemasons, you don't have to be a Master Mason to be Grand Master. You need to be a fellow of the craft. So we have our first high degree. Now the attitude of the Grand Lodge was, and it turns out this has paid off in the long run. They said, this is kind of interesting. If you guys don't rock the boat, come on board. And they accepted the Master Mason's degree. 1730, Pritchard's Masonry Dissected is published. If you read the ritual of the 3rd degree in there, you're going to look at it and say, that's not the way we do it in our Grand Lodge. I can believe they do it in Maryland. They're kind of strange over there. Or they do it out in California. They're really strange in California. But it's a recognizable 3rd degree. So from 1725, the first appearance in the minute book, to 5 years later, there's a published ritual that is recognizable as the work we do today. There is and talk about selling like hotcakes. First edition sells out in 1 day. Second day they reprint. They have 4 editions plus a pirated edition within 2 weeks. I'm an author. I was pretty excited that after 6 years or 8 years we got to a 2nd edition. Second day they have to have a 2nd edition. This stuff is selling, and it's not selling because the citizens of London are that interested in the secrets of Masonry. It's because the Masons themselves want to know how to open and close a Master Mason's lodge. When does the deacon stand up? Who knocks at the door? When do you say the prayers? All of that's in there, which the Grand Lodge was not getting. Now, 1733 and 34, we're going to see evidence of yet another high degree. Now look at this, 1717, Grand Lodge is created with 2 degrees. 8 years later, you see the Master Mason's degree. 8 years after that, we see evidence in a list of lodges that there's a lodge of there's a Scotch Mason's Lodge. And you look at the list, Master Mason's Lodge, Master Mason's Lodge, Scotch Mason's Lodge, Master Mason's Lodge, Master Mason's Lodge. They're doing something different. They're doing something sufficiently different that they wanted to caution you that this is not a lodge that you want to show up at unless you're a Scotch Mason. Just like if you were visiting in town, you might not want to show up at an Eastern Star meeting thinking you're going to a lodge meeting, or vice versa. Next year, another list of lodges. Now it's called the Scots Mason's Lodge. I've been told the difference is whether they are from Scotland or whether they drink Scotch whiskey. I don't know that that's true or not. But we can see that there is enough difference with the Scotch Masons that their lodges are being identified. Now we go to Bath, a little bit west of England. A year later, The following worthy brothers were made and admitted Scots Master Masons. Do you need any more evidence that Scottish Masonry, that something is going on? When we get, in a few more years, I can show you the first hint of what we think they were doing. But something is going on that's different, a high degree separate from what's controlled by Grand Lodge. Grand Lodge is now absorbed and has accepted the Master Mason's degree. They don't absorb and accept any other degrees, but they're perfectly happy to let them just go on as long as they don't rock the boat. Now, 1737, the other side of the English Channel, Andrew Michael Ramsay gives an oration to new members of the Grand Lodge of France. In there he says, our ancestors, the Crusaders, for the first time in Masonic history, Freemasonry is associated with the Crusading Knights. The legend of the Knights Templar is a wonderful romantic legend. It has great teaching potential. It has zero historical validity to it. This is the year it appears. Now, right now, they're Crusading Knights. Pretty soon, they're quickly going to morph into Knights Templar. And what happens is, on one side of the channel, you have the Templar tradition, the Crusading Knights tradition appearing. On the other side, you have Scottish Masonry, what eventually became the Scottish Rite. And as the two go back and forth across the channel, they intermingle. And so today you can see with the Lodge of Perfection, the Knights Kadosh, this is the Templars and the rebuilding tradition there. I'll show you more about that later. 1738 in Lisbon, there is an Irish lodge. Hugo O'Kelly is the worshipful master. And in 1738, the Pope issues the papal encyclical In Eminenti. Freemasonry is prescribed. What does Hugo O'Kelly does? He gives orders that there be no more such meetings. He is a very loyal Catholic. He is a very loyal citizen, and the Inquisition is actively working in Portugal. So he knows where his bread is buttered. Now, what happens next is very interesting. The Inquisition finds out, gee, we've got this group of people that just got condemned by the Pope. We need to find out more. Mr. O'Kelly would like to talk to you. Imagine that Don Corleone sends Luca Broccio to see you and says that the Don would like to talk with you this afternoon. So what are you going to do? You're going to put on a fresh suit and you're going to go see the Don. Okay, when the Inquisition says that they want to talk to you, you go talk to them. Now here's what Hugo O'Kelly says to the Inquisition, that there are more classes which are called excellent Masons and Grand Masons which are above all others. Is this evidence of higher degrees? Maybe the Grand Masons are the Grand Officers, but what about the excellent Masons? Is that a new degree? Maybe it's past masters. Maybe it's district deputy Grand Masters, except I don't think they'd set up a district deputy system by 1735. But there are more classes of Masons. So here's a hint that something's going on, and since there are at least two classes of Masons that O'Kelly knows about, we can put the Grand Lodge officers in one class, but then there's still that other class. Maybe there's another degree we don't know about. Now look at this, Old Lodge number 1 in London. The following 9 members were made Scotch Master Masons. There is a new degree going on right there. Now let me give you a little insight to the motivation. Not only is it fun having a new degree, and the way I look at it, what happens when you have a blockbuster movie? Hollywood immediately comes out with a sequel. And if it's really good, shortly after that, they'll come out with a prequel. And if it's really good, they'll spin off one of the characters into another series. Well, that's what's going on with Masonry. They come up with a pretty good story with the Grand Master Hiram Abiff and the rebuilding of King Solomon's Temple. It is so good that they start having to fill in the plot holes. And so you have sequels, and you have prequels, and you have spin-offs. And here's an important motivator. If you confer the first degree, or the second degree, or the third degree in your lodge, you have to give a cut of the fees to the Grand Lodge. If you confer anything else, you get to keep all the fees yourself. Follow the money. So not only is it cool to expand on the Master Mason's legend that has just recently been created, You're making more money this way. Now, Bristol, a little further west than that, members of this lodge that are already Master Masons may be made Scotch Masters. There should be no doubt in your mind at this point that Scotch Master Masons or Scotch Masons or Scots Masons are a step beyond being a Master Mason. You've got to be a Master Mason, you pay an extra fee, you then get the next degree. We don't know what the degree is. Now, in just a minute, in chronological order, I'll give you a hint of what's going on. Now, 1742, Scots Masonry is crossing the channel to Germany, to Berlin. We have the first Scots Masters Lodge established in Berlin. Their minutes were confiscated by the Nazis in World War II. The minute books made it back to the Grand Orient de France. Now, we can't sit in lodge with members of the Grand Orient de France. Let me assure you there is an active interlibrary exchange going on with the Grand Orient de France. They're really good guys. But Scots Mastery, we still don't know what they're doing, but a separate organization with separate minutes and separate records exist in Berlin, and now those records are back in Paris. Here's what may be the first reference to the Royal Arch. Now, I find it very curious. When I was coming up in Masonry, all I read was the Ray Vaughan Denslow material from the General Grand Chapter that the Royal Arch was always an integral part of the Grand Lodge, and then was separated with the creation of the Master Mason's degree, and so you had the Master Mason's degree, and the separated conclusion of the Master Mason's degree was left in the Royal Arch. You all have read that? I mean, it was based on the best evidence at the time. Denslow was not consciously lying. There is no historical evidence today to support that. The evidence is that the Scots Masons came first. And it's going to be I'll show you just in a couple more slides a curious connection between the Scots Masons and the Royal Arch. But here is what may be the first reference to the Royal Arch. Now, this is describing a parade that was held on St. John's Day in 1742. Fourthly, the Royal Arch carried by two excellent Masons. Now, you remember Hugo O'Kelly talked about excellent Masons and Grand Masons. So these could be that higher class of Masons he was talking about. They're carrying the Royal Arch. Fifthly, the Master and with all of his stuff and his debt. Now, here's what you have to decide. Are those two excellent Masons carrying a replica of the Ark of the Covenant? Are they carrying a replica of Noah's Ark? Now, in French, the word arche both means ark, like Ark of the Covenant and Noah's Ark, and it also means arch, like a architectural arch. So if, given that the upper class spoke French, and French was a fashionable language in England, perhaps they were using ark and arche in its French meaning. So were they carrying a replica of the Ark of the Covenant? Were they carrying a replica of Noah's Ark? Or it's in a parade. And I find it very easy to imagine the two excellent Masons have a piece of thin wood that goes up and makes an arch, and the ribbons or something are hanging down from it. You know how when the Grand Master visits the deacon with the stamps, and he walks underneath it? Why wouldn't the Master of the Lodge walk underneath an arch? And they call it the rope. We don't know. We have no idea what the Royal Arch was. We'll see evidence in another year of Royal Arch Masonry as we know it. I don't know. I'm hard-pressed to believe that in a parade that someone could identify the Royal Arch. 1743, first evidence of the Royal Order of Scotland. Scotch Herodom of Kilwinning, that is, that's very definitely what we have here is the Royal Order of Scotland. So now we have had appear Scots Master Masons or Scots Masons. Maybe the Royal Arch. We're getting the Knights Templar appearing on the other side, or Crusading Knights on the other side of the channel, and now we've got the Royal Order of Scotland. And this is 1743. This is only, 26 years after the formation of the Grand Lodge. We're having high degrees pop up every 5 or 10 years. This is not an isolated phenomenon. This is not something that you can say was just tacked on and we can clean it off and get back to pure ancient masonry. Pure ancient masonry has always had high degrees and extra things to do and other more exclusive places to play. 1743, the same year, Baron von Hont in Paris starts an interesting trend in masonry. He is visited one night in his apartment, by masked Masons. One of them he identifies as the Red Feather Knight because he has a red feather in his hat. And he is initiated into a special branch of Masonry. He's initiated into this branch of Masonry and told that the true secret of Freemasonry is the Knights Templar started it when they found secrets underneath the temple, and then they returned with the secrets, and they started Masonry to protect the secrets. You heard that story before? Very popular myth. Von Hunt is told, you are now a member of this Templar order, and you are given authority to spread it throughout Europe, but be known that you are being watched by your unknown superiors, and they will make themselves known to you. They will appear to you at some time in the future, and you must promise to do anything they tell you to do. Ooh, that's kind of cool. I've been asked to be a secret agent. All I'm doing is waiting to get my instructions from the unknown superiors, and I'll go out on my mission. So he spreads this all over Europe, and it becomes wildly popular. They thought there was something cool and fashionable about swearing utter loyalty to their unknown superiors. They didn't know who they were, they didn't know where they'd appear. Well, by 1782, von Hunt is dead. And all the existing branches of his strict observance get together in Wilhelmsbad, Germany. That's kind of, the unknown superiors talk to you, they haven't talked to me. Have you talked to the unknown superiors? Because they haven't talked to me. And everyone kind of agrees there are no unknown superiors. Not only that, everyone agrees that there is zero historical connection between the Knights Templar and Master Masons. Nada. Nothing. Now, here's something to keep in mind. Whether Romeo and Juliet were actual people, and whether the Montagues and the Capulets had a real feud, the play Romeo and Juliet is a great way to strike home that family jealousies and family feuds are bad. Whether Othello really lived or not as a real person, the play Othello is a great lesson that uncontrolled jealousy is a very, very bad pattern. Whether the Knights Templar have any historical connection with Freemasonry or not doesn't change their value as a teaching lesson. So, the convent of Wilhelmsbad rectified the strict observance. They created the Rite Ecclesiae Rectifié, the rectified Scottish Rite. They created the Chevalier Bienfaisant de la Cité Sainte, the Knights Beneficent of the Holy City, or that's what they call the Knights Templar in Europe. So they rectify it, get rid of all the legends, and they use it as a teaching tool, not as a historical, not to teach history, but to teach moral lessons. And they get rid of the unknown superiors. 1743, this is interesting. Also, when I was a young Mason and I read, the prevailing theory was that the high degrees originated in France. It was the Frenchmen, the frogs, that liked all the fancy, gussied up stuff, and they're the ones that invented the high degrees. Well, that ain't the case. It's not till 1743 that the Scots Masons make their way over to France. The Knights Templar, while Ramsay gave his oration, they appear in Germany. The Scots Masons begin in England and then go over to Germany. And now in 1743, the Grand Lodge, for the first time, takes notice of the Scots Masters. Basically, what happens is one of the lodges out in the provinces writes to the Grand Lodge and says, "Dear Grand Master, we have guys showing up in lodge that say they don't have to take off their hats because they're Scots Masons. They don't have to take off their swords because they're Scots Masons. And they don't have to stand up when the worshipful master gavels up the lodge because they're Scots Masons. WTF? Sincerely in return." And this is the response to the Grand Lodge. Okay, that's a loose translation. That's a loose translation. The Grand Lodge says they have no special privilege. Next year they give them special privilege. But now we can see the introduction of Scots Masons into France. Now here comes the first reference to the Royal Arch. Now, this is 19 years after the introduction of Scots Masters. This is, what is that, 27 years after the creation of the Grand Lodge. The Royal Arch now appears in form. Now, keep in mind, when you see the first written or printed record, this is probably a few years after it really was going on. But there is no reference. There's no record until you get to 1744. And so here we have, over in York, England, a class of Masons who received more pay because they had more knowledge. Sounds like a Royal Arch. This is now talking about something that we can relate to, a class of Masons that had more knowledge. Now here we come to the first tidbit of knowledge that tells us what the Scots Masons were doing. We know what the Royal Arch does because we still had it today. 1744, there's an expose in France, the perfect Mason. And here's what they had to say about the Scots Masons. Instead of weeping over the ruins, they are going to rebuild the temple. And Zerubbabel chose from the 3 grades the most capable workmen and created a 4th grade. This is the Royal Arch. This is actually it's not the Royal Arch, it is the oldest legend of high degree, well, of course the oldest legend of high degree Masonry is Hiram Abiff. This is the second oldest legend of the captives returning from Babylon to Jerusalem to rebuild the temple. And while they're rebuilding the temple, under the rubble of the temple, under the rubbish of the temple, they find a great secret. That is the Scots Masters legend. That is now the 13th and 14th degree of the Scottish Rite. It is the Royal Arch legend. It's now the Royal Arch degree. It is the prominent degree that the temple is built and destroyed, then the temple is rebuilt and great secrets are found. Now things are starting to make sense. Now an interesting thing happens. Scots Masters disappear in 1745. They're going in England. They're just not there. Now they continue going strong in France. They continue going strong in Germany. All of Europe has Scots Masters in Germany. Europe never really got into the Royal Arch. All of a sudden, the Royal Arch takes over. Any of you who are British historians interested in British history, what happened in 1745 that might cause Scots Masons to become unpopular in England? Bonnie Prince Charlie decides to invade from Scotland to recapture his crown. He is turned back by the British. His Scots army is utterly slaughtered at the Battle of Flodden. He makes it back to Scotland, hops in a ship, and sails home. From that point forward, having anything to do with Scotland and England was not very smart. It was not very smart at all. And I can just imagine all the Scots Masters saying, okay guys, we've got a problem. We can't be Scots Masters anymore. What are we going to do? I don't know. We've got this big arch in the story. Why don't we just call ourselves Royal Arch? Yeah, that's a good idea. Royal Arch is a lot safer than Scots Masons. Who knows? They just disappear in England, and they're replaced by the Royal Arch. But that makes sense. Now, 1752 in England, John Mackey was a guy that if you bought him a leg of mutton dinner, he would give you a Masonic degree. And if you bought another leg of mutton, bought him another leg of mutton dinner, he'd give you another Masonic degree. He would keep giving you Masonic degrees as long as there was meat on that leg of mutton. The Grand Lodge examines him, finds out that he knows nothing about the Royal Arch, declares him a fraud, and expels him. But now the Grand Lodge is getting involved in the Royal Arch. Now here comes a record I like, 1753, the first known conferral of the Royal Arch degree in Fredericksburg, Virginia. Quattro Coronati Lodge is really fun, the way occasionally I would say, do you have anything to offer from the colonies, Brother Morris? And when I do have something to offer, it'll be like, well, that was an excellent presentation, brother, on the early records of the Royal Arch. Did you happen to take into account the first recorded instance of the Royal Arch? The premier instance from which all other descend? Oh, you mean Virginia. I'm just speaking of the first recorded instance of the Royal Arch degree, and I don't notice you mentioning that in your paper. Now we've got the Royal Arch being conferred, and we know it's happening. We had evidence. They talk about Royal Arch Masons in York. You see him examining Brother Mackey. Does he have knowledge of the Royal Arch? And then finally it appears in the minute book. Now 1761, our high degrees are going to take another interesting turn. Now what I hope you've been noticing so far is high degrees are popping up everywhere. They're popping up everywhere. This is not an isolated phenomenon that's tacked on as a second-hand thought to the body of Freemasonry. As Freemasonry evolves and grows, more and more high degrees start popping up everywhere. They are an integral part from, well, not day one, year 8, an integral part of Freemasonry from year 8. 1761, Stephen Morin, Etienne Morin, He's a wine negociant. He sells wine, he buys wine cheap, he sells it high, and that's what all merchants do. You buy cheap, you sell high. That is if you want to stay in business. Buying high and selling cheap, it doesn't last long. You can do it for a short while. He's immigrating from France, 1761, to the Caribbean. He's going to make his fortune. Now in 1761, the emperors of the East and West, we think the emperors of the East and West was the Grand Lodge of France taking off their green jerseys and putting on their orange jerseys. It's the same group of guys, and we now reconstitute ourselves as the emperors of the East and West. We think that's what it was. But anyway, he gets a patent that authorizes him to establish perfect and sublime masonry in all parts of the world. And he's getting ready to travel over to the New World. Perfect masonry is the lodge of perfection. This is the series of myths that occur of what happens after the murder of the master builder and before they rediscover the lost mason's work. That is the masonry of perfection. Sublime masonry is what happens after that. Sublime masonry is the return from Babylon to Jerusalem, the interpretation of the Rose Croix, the Knights Kadosh, and that's sublime masonry. So that's what he's established to do. 1763, he arrives in Santo Domingo. This is the Isle of Hispaniola. You have Santo Domingo, or you have the Dominican Republic on one side, Haiti on the other side. It took him 2 years because his ship got captured by the English. He was taken as a prisoner of war, and he was paroled, and he was allowed to wander around his town, but don't leave the town. And he had interaction with English Masons, so this may have influenced him. So he arrives in 1763, and what we don't know is we don't know exactly what degrees he brought with him. What do we know about Masonry of 1763? Well, in 1763, the book Allegorical Conversations, Conversaciones Alegories, is published. It is a series of catechisms of all the degrees of Freemasonry. The first one bunch is published in 1763, the second group is published in 1766. Do we know if these are accurate or not? Okay, here's what we do know. The Grand Lodge of France tried to expel the author. They bought all the copies of the book and they burned them. Decide for yourself whether they were accurate or not. If you're in the intelligence business, it's much better to ignore any leaks than it is to acknowledge them. They obviously did not take intelligence reporting 101. Now, here's what we have. Allegorical Conversations Organized by Wisdom. That's the full title of the book. There is the 10-degree system of high degrees that they have. Now here's one of the, what's interesting, I remember in high school, my English teacher told us that Shakespeare and his plays offers histories that are different from what we know. Well, the reason they're different is he based his plays upon the best historical books at the time in England, which were inaccurate. So if you read the histories that were published in the late 1500s, you say, oh, now I understand why Shakespeare did this, because he was basing on what was thought to be true. What we have here with these catechisms are not the Scottish Rite or the York Rite degrees. They are what the Scottish Rite and the York Rite degrees were based upon. So if you're interested in the evolution of high degrees, this book was translated and published in facsimile by the Scottish Rite Research Society, and last year sent to all of its members as the bonus book. You can buy it online. The Perfect English Master, for example, in it there is the candidate is given a gold ring and is told, you are now joined by virtue to our organization and only death can separate you from us. Does that sound familiar to anything we might do today? Source and origin of the 14th degree ring. 1763, the same year, Le Plus Secret Mystère comes out, the most secret mysteries of the high degrees of masonry unveiled. Now this is different from the Allegorical Conversations. And it's different because what they do is they give full-blown scripts. They describe the settings, they describe the stage setting, they describe the costume, they give dialogue when you stand up and when you sit down and what you're supposed to do. They have a 7-degree system. You get in there, the elect of the Perignon is almost the same as our 9th degree, Elu of the 9. You look at it and say, oh, yeah, that's the same degree. The elect of the 15 is our 9th degree and 10th degree glued together. And so you cut them apart. And so you can look at these and you can see these as precursors of the degrees we do today. Now, 1763, Stephen Morin is now in Santo Domingo, and he has the Order of the Royal Secret with him. It's also known as the Rite of Perfection. This is the 25-degree secret from degree 1 to Sublime Prince of the Royal Secret, which is the 25th degree. One of the questions is, was it created by Stephen Morin? Well, here's some curious things. Sometime between 1763, when he lands in Santo Domingo, and 1767, when Henry Andrew Franklin signs the charter for the Lodge of Perfection in Albany, New York, Morin appoints Franklin as Inspector General. So we know it couldn't have been before 1763 because Morin is not in Santo Domingo, and it had to be before 1767 because that's when Franklin is signing as an Inspector General. We don't know when he was made an Inspector General. Franklin is an important figure in the high degrees of Masonry. Lived in Albany, New York. He was a Dutch merchant. He would buy stuff cheap in New York, go down the Hudson to the Caribbean, sell it at a profit, buy stuff cheap in the Caribbean, sail back up the Hudson and sell it in Albany. And so he establishes a Lodge of Perfection in 1767, Albany, New York. Let me digress and tell you a little story about the Lodge of Perfection in New York. You guys may know that in 1990 and 1995, the two Supreme Councils jointly published the book Masonic Philanthropy. I was the author. That's where we got the figure $1.5 billion a day in philanthropy. I mean, that was a tight figure in 1995. It's probably $2.5 million today. Bob Ralston was Grand Commander. He basically had no interest in the book. He inherited it and so had to do it. And all of a sudden, we are days away from publishing, and I get a call from Dick Curtis, editor of the Northern Light. Says, Brent, Grand Commander Ralston has read your book. You have to make changes. Sure, what does he want? He wants you to mention that the Albany Lodge of Perfection was established in 1767. Dick, that's a level of detail that I'm not going into in my book. That's just much too detailed. Well, I'm sorry, the Grand Commander says it has to be there. Okay, Dick, so you're telling me that I must include the level of detail of the creation of the first high-degree bodies in the United States. That's right, Dick. The Albany Lodge of Perfection must be there in 1767. I can do nothing but what the Grand Commander tells me to do. So I also had to include New Orleans in 1766. Okay, Franklin transcribes the 25 degrees of the Rite of Perfection into at least 4 books. They're about the books are about the size, a little bigger than a piece of legal paper, several hundred pages each. There is one copy in the Northern Masonic jurisdiction. There is one copy in the United Grand Lodge of England. There is one copy in the Grand Lodge of the Supreme Council for England and Wales. And there is one copy in the bedroom of Mr. Naveed Ahmed in Lahore, Pakistan. That is an entire story in itself. But this is how we know what the degrees of the Order of the Royal Secret of the Rite of Perfection are. 1769, this is another opportunity for me to ever so gently remind my dear friends that the colonists had a few firsts themselves. This is the first conferral of the Knights Templar anywhere. This is the first conferral that is merited. There are no records of an earlier conferral of the Knights Templar degree. So you can see what's happening. We are getting gradually, year by year by year, more and more complexity. You can see evolving, and eventually the Knights Templar are going to grow up, the Royal Arch are going to grow up, and they're going to come together. The Crusading Knights and the Scots Masons come together, and you've got the Scottish Rite, the Royal Order of Scotland, and so all of these are popping up as a constant, integral part of the Grand Lodge. 1801, the Mother Supreme Council of the World is created. What they did is they took the Order of the Royal Secret, they glued 8 degrees onto it. They got up to 33 degrees now. The motto of the Supreme Council is Ordo ab chaos. And let me tell you why there was chaos. If I were a Deputy Inspector General of the Order of the Royal Secret, and I could confer the 25 degrees, for a fee, I'd make you a 25th degree Mason. But wait, there's more. For an extra fee, I can make you a Deputy Inspector General, and then you can sell the degrees to your buddy and make back the money you paid me. And then you can make your buddy an Inspector General, and he can sell it to his friends and make back the money he gave to you. By the time you got to 1801, there were at least 75 Deputies Inspector Generals traveling up and down the East Coast of the United States selling the degrees. 75! and every one of them could duplicate themselves. One of the smartest things that the Supreme Council did is they blew on 8 more degrees. Now, I'm the peddler out here. I'm selling degrees 4 through 25. That is, what, 22 degrees that I'm selling for a certain price. You guys are now offering 32 degrees. The 33rd is off limits, but you have 32 degrees. So you've gone from 25 to 32. You've added on 7 degrees. That is 33% more than my inventory. And so the Supreme Council says to all of these inspectors that are out there, have we got a deal for you? If you give us your patent, making you a Deputy Inspector General, we will give you a new patent that lets you confer up to degree 32 and no charge to you. You just increased your inventory by 33%, sell them for whatever you want. The only thing you can't do is you cannot create new Inspectors General. Well, they took them on. They said, that's a good deal. We've increased our inventory by 33% at no cost. And we weren't getting that much out of the Inspector General anyway. And so that's how the Supreme Council took over high degree Masonry. It has now become the largest and most widely dispersed high degree system in the world. There's more Scottish Rite Masons anywhere in the world than any other part of Masonry. So that original Scots Masons, Scots Masters, we're not 100% certain, but all the evidence is that's what evolved into the Scottish Rite from 1733. The first high degree is now the most widespread one in the world. What happens after 1811? Well, it's not nearly as interesting as the stuff that happened before. We'll make that the subject in my next talk. And do you have any questions? Yes, sir.
I have a math problem.
Okay, 17 is the answer.
It's hard.
17, is that the answer?
No.
Oh, okay.
And perhaps I thought I was listening carefully, but I'm curious. You said 1598 was the first lodge, and then I think you said that the first evidence of high degrees was 8 years later, but then you indicated 1725 was the first recorded high degrees. Can you tell me about 1598 to 1725?
Let me clarify that. 1598 William Shaw, in his statutes, instructed the lodges to start keeping minutes. And the Shaw statutes came out in early 1590s. Okay, so lodge minutes date from that point. William Shaw also said that when you get an apprentice, be sure to enter him in the book. That's where we get our entered apprentices from, because Shaw said enter the apprentices. So 1598, 1599 are the 2 earliest lodge minutes that we have in the world. Now, you go forward to 1717, and the first Grand Lodge is created in London. So that I've been waving my hands a lot when I'm talking. So we get to 1717, we have the first Grand Lodge that's created, and it is composed of 2 classes of members. You have brothers and fellows, apprentices and fellowcrafts. Then 8 years after that, in 1725, we now get to the first evidence that in the list there are Scots Masons lodges to be distinguished from Master Masons lodges. We don't know what they're doing. Now we find out, some 18 years later in this French exposure, we then make the inference that that's what they were doing in 1720. No, I'm sorry, I misspoke again. 1725 is the Master Masons degree. It's 1733 that's the Scots Masons. So 1717 is Grand Lodge. 8 years later, 1725 is the Master Masons degree, and 8 years after that is the Scots Masons. When I get excited, I lose track. Okay. Any other questions? I guess I did well. Thank you very much.